Recently, I watched quite a few videos featuring that developer survey from Stack Overflow where it actually says 80% of developers aren't actually happy. But I personally never felt unhappy as a developer, so it got me thinking, where is the joy in coding? And in this video, I want to talk about two things. Because I spent over 10 years being a software engineer, I definitely know where the joy isn't. So I want to discuss a few of those places. But then, I want to tell you about all the places where I do find joy today in my everyday work as a developer, building a product and shipping it to production. So I'm not really sure where I read this statistic, but it's something like 90% of the code that is currently written is just basic transformations like serialization and deserialization from different formats, writing stuff into the database without much processing at all. And this all adds up to a humongous amount of boilerplate code. And when I think about my work at my day job, I can seriously relate to this because so much of the code is dedicated to just writing dumb API endpoints that don't really apply any kind of business logic, and they're simply there to save data to a database. And I will say with absolute certainty that this is the one place that doesn't bring joy in coding. But it also doesn't bring misery. That's reserved for place number 2. So what is the place that brings misery, at least for me? Whenever I try to think back at the time when I dreaded my work the most, I was faced with a heavily over-engineered codebase for no reason at all. And I want to give you a concrete example which might sound a little funny to you, but it's actually quite realistic. So at work we have a service that I'm not gonna name because it's gonna reveal who wrote it, but I'm just gonna say that this service is very rarely used. I would say it handles maybe 3 to 4 requests a day. Now granted, those requests do spin up some background work to be done, but that work almost never lasts more than a few minutes. So if you think about it, a few requests a day, each lasting a few minutes, you don't really need to over-engineer this system. However, what actually happened is that a couple of developers sat down and they made a fully distributed consumer producer system with multiple Kafka queues, multiple databases with multiple services that all have to be deployed to the same version of the shared schema in order for everything to work. So one day I got a task to fix a particular bug in this process, and it took me forever to fix it because it was never clear where the bug is happening, in which Kafka queue, in which database. It was very difficult to run locally, and that is one of the most dreadful things that I ever had to do at my work. But that being said, there are things that do in fact bring joy when coding, at least for me. Now this is not for everybody, but I'm gonna show you a few bits and pieces of my code for my side project that actually made me happy. Now, it's not the best code you will ever see, and it's by far not following the best practices, but it was somehow very joyful to work on. And so the first thing that brings joy for me is very simple, straightforward code. And so the example I want to show you is the implementation of the keyboard shortcuts for my App 1 menu. Now you could think of many different ways to create an abstraction, to maybe create some kind of a command pattern here. The reality is it's much simpler to write code that simply goes, if this, then that. It's much easier to write and it's much easier to read. And yes, this code might be more difficult to test, but it's so easy to understand and it was very joyful to write it. And along the same lines, I find that being a little bit reckless while writing the code, being a little bit quote-unquote creative, actually brings joy. If you stop for a moment and you simply write the code that does only the thing that you want it to do and nothing else, suddenly writing your app feels like so much fun. I almost forgot how little code can do so much if you don't bother yourself with all of these abstractions. And to that extent, I have a lot of global constants, I have a lot of global variables, but it just makes the code so much more readable. And I'm really enjoying writing that kind of code. Now, this is my side project. I don't really have to impress anyone with the quality of the code, and so I'm using it as a source of joy. Now, another thing that brings joy with coding is finding elegant solutions. And I want to give you one example from this same codebase. So some time ago, for the window manager part of one menu, I wrote this piece of functionality that when you're dragging a window and you hold Command, it's actually going to search for the available space under the cursor and it's going to try and snap the window there. And it's very useful if you're trying to create an ad hoc asymmetrical layout, but what's really elegant about this is that as an emergent property of this implementation, there is a way to make windows stick to each other while resizing them. And the way it works is when you drag an edge of a window, you make sure that all other windows fill the remaining available space. And just like magic, they all snap to the correct positions. And implementing that took literally 5 minutes, not more than that. And the final thing that brings joy to me is taking it a little bit slow. I feel like a lot of the developer influencers are pushing this idea that you always at all costs need to work really fast, and that includes typing. But what I found brings joy to me is that I sometimes just go slowly. I write 1 or 2 lines of code, I stop and think about it. Can I make this better or not? Is it worth making better? I sort of enjoy the process of coding itself. And to that end, on some of my projects, I don't even have a code formatter. And I know that might sound a little bit weird and unusual in 2024, but when I write a few lines of code, I actually go back and format them, and I use that time to think about the code itself. And that really helps me solidify what exactly am I trying to do, gives me a moment to think, to plan a little bit ahead. You know, I really enjoy that easygoing process of writing code. And if I just install a whole bunch of plugins, if I learn Vim with all the key bindings, yes, I'll be flying through my code base, but I don't feel like I would be enjoying it. So those are the things that really bring joy to me while coding. I hope that other people in the industry can find joy as well, because 80% of unhappy developers does seem a little abysmal. And I find that joy can be found in the small things, in the small actions, thinking about your code, taking it slowly, being a little bit creative, and in that process finding hidden gems and elegant solutions that you otherwise might not have found. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.